Well, welcome to everyone to the Center for Faith and Inquiry at Gordon College's interview for our Homecoming 2020 celebration and also for Gordon College Convocation. Obviously, it's a little bit different this year in the light of the coronavirus and its many ramifications, including moving the Homecoming celebration online. So a warm welcome to all of you among our alumni, our trustees, our administration, faculty, staff, and students. Delighted to be here with you today. I am Dr. Bill Barker of the Center for Faith and Inquiry and also a professor at Gordon College. And today I'm excited about this interview that we're conducting. So every year, the Center for Faith and Inquiry has an annual theme that we focus on through a series of lectures and student events to probe the ideas of that theme. This year's theme is Courage in Crisis, which seems a very timely topic for the many things going on around our campus, our nation, and our world. And so as we pursue biblical wisdom on those topics, today we wanted to bring to you an interview dealing with the topic of courage, and not necessarily directly courage in crisis, but courage within the vocations, some of the vocations of our alumni. And so we wanted to interview a small panel of Gordon College alumni to explore this idea of the courage of Christians in their respective lives and vocations. So I want to give a warm welcome to you all as our alumni panelist for this interview today. And I'll just begin by offering a brief biographical sketch of each one of you. And if you could just give us a little bit of a wave as we introduce each person here. First, we'll start off by welcoming Tatenda McConey. Tatenda, really delighted to have you here today with us. And
thank you.
So glad you're here. Tatenda graduated from Gordon College with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry, biochemistry, and health professions concentrations in 2017. So quite aggressive there in the health sciences, and she's used that astounding academic ability well. Her last semester as an undergraduate student in the summer was spent at the Nelson Mandela School of Medicine in South Africa, where she performed question-based HIV research, and she is still pursuing work in public health. She has worked at the Center for Virology and Vaccine Research at Harvard Med School and Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital. Additionally, now she is currently at the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. So a warm welcome to you, Tatenda, and plenty to dive into there on the issue of vaccines. And Adam Macleod applauding. Since he applauds, we'll move directly to Adam. Adam Macleod, welcome. Adam is a professor of law at Faulkner. He has been a visiting fellow in the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and a Thomas Edison Fellow in the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property at George Mason University. Adam is also the distinguished author of a number of books and dozens, scores really, of academic level peer-reviewed journals, essays, book chapters, and has been a commentator for various news outlets, and has a robust legal career. Professor Macleod writes and speaks in numerous venues about the foundations of private law and private ordering. He teaches courses concerning property, intellectual property, jurisprudence, and private law theory. He is a faculty member in the Witherspoon Institute's graduate seminar on the moral foundations of law. And I know he's argued and submitted briefs to some pretty significant courts in our land, both at the state and the federal level. And so maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that from Adam today. But Adam, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
And last
Appreciate
but certainly not least, Dr. Soggy Bun. Soggy, a warm welcome to you as well. Soggy Bun is the chair of the Biblical and Religious Studies and Philosophy Department at Grove City College. Previously, he taught at Oak Hill College in London. And his primary area of research and teaching is in textual criticism, the Hebrew language, the Pentateuch, and the prophetic books. Soggy as well is an accomplished author, having published a number of books and currently working on commentaries on Deuteronomy, as well as a number of articles, essays, and chapters. He is also the executive director of the Project on Rural Ministry, a Lilly Endowment funded initiative that seeks to leverage the resources of a Christian college to serve rural churches and their pastors. He is also scholar in residence at his local church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So a welcome to you as well, Soggy. Really delighted to have you all here with us today. And so having introduced all of you, I want to jump right into our questions today with the time that we have. And as we talk about courage, I want to make sure that we're all in some way have a shared definition of courage and what that means as we seek to explore that topic. And so, Soggy, I'll begin with you, especially given your theological and philosophical backgrounds. And then I'm going to ask each one of you, Tatenda and Adam, also to offer a definition of courage. So how would you define courage, Soggy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a distinction perhaps between what biblical courage is, or how the Christian might construe what courage is, and how others. I mean, courage at its core, I think, is the willingness to say or do something, especially when there is a cost. And courage, I think, is also, we have to keep in mind that it's not an autonomous, self-generated virtue. It's something that is always produced by faith in something, right? Whether that's in God or something else. So I think, a starting place would be, for a Christian, would be to say that, courage is our ability to step out and be integrous, do something, say something in the light of, for a Christian, I think that would be the promises of God, or, whatever it is that is underlying that person's confidence and the reason for which they will then step out.
Yeah, very good, I think, because that also naturally sort of ties courage into a number of other historically held virtues of
Right.
Christians. I appreciate that. Tatenda, what about you? How would you define courage as we think about it today?
I think on a more personal level, like for me, courage is like waking up every day and doing like what scares me. And every day, there are voices that tell you that you're not enough or like this can't be done. And I think waking up every day and being like, okay, I'm still gonna do this despite the voices around me is how I would define courage.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tatenda, especially not just because you're able to bring it down out of the philosophical realm into the daily living where each of us get up every morning, as you say. But I also appreciate that in the sense that I think, a lot of our alumni have communicated, well, in the past, how do I embrace some of the virtues and some of the callings of Scripture that are articulated at various points by the CFI in our discussions. And there's almost sort of a feeling of, well, I'm not doing anything significant. And I think what you're saying is that there is a daily courage that we might perceive as mundane, but actually does require something of us to stand up with fortitude and integrity. So I appreciate that. Adam, I know this is something that you've had to consider, particularly as you're training your law students and as you pursue the legal profession. Can you share with us a definition of courage?
Yeah, well, of course, classically, courage was conceived as the disposition and ability to do the right thing when doing the right thing is costly and risky, as Soggy alluded to earlier. There's a whole classical tradition which comes from natural law thinkers and the Stoics and others, which Christians, of course, then took over and really enhanced and cultivated a lot of the early church fathers, and then, of course, great Christian thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. And of course, the right thing, often there's obstacles that change depending upon the circumstance, right? So different forms of courage enable us to overcome different kinds of obstacles. And so three really central forms, of course: physical courage, which enables us to do the right thing when there's a risk of physical harm or pain or even loss of life. This, of course, is an important courage in the military, as where you serve, and for first responders and for athletes. And then, of course, moral courage, the disposition and ability to do the right thing when we have temptations to follow our passions or appetites or dispositions, feelings that might cloud our reason and prevent us from doing what we know by God's gift of reason to be the right thing to do. And then, of course, one that's really important for the four of us, and that's intellectual courage. And that's the disposition and the ability to pursue truth, especially when the prevailing orthodoxies are going away from truth. And the fear to overcome there is the fear of disapproval from our peers, from those who hold positions of power and influence, who have the ability to damage our reputations, to cause us professional injury, and to say, no, I'm going to continue to pursue knowledge of truth, even if it costs me personally and professionally. And that's, that's a disposition that Christians, of course, were specialized in. In my field, for centuries, it was Christians who first organized the Corpus Juris Civilis and gave the West the rule of law. It was Christians who first articulated the case for abolishing slavery. It was Christians who first articulated the case against eugenics. It was Christians who gave us the intellectual foundations of the civil rights movement, all when it was very unpopular and costly to do so. And so there's a great Christian heritage of intellectual virtue that is worth tapping into, I think.
Yeah, that's really excellent, Adam. I appreciate that at so many different levels, in part because as we talk about courage in crisis, as you note, there's a great history of Christianity demonstrating courage in crisis from the times of the Roman persecutions to this very moment in time, and having all those different types of courage, which you've so helpfully outlined. Another thing that you've touched on, and I think it's helpful for us to pivot in this category, is how we distinguish between different types of courage. And by that, when I say us, I don't mean the four of us sitting here today or anyone really in modernity, as much as I do think about Augustine and Aquinas and the ways that the church historically has defined courage. They really spoke of this virtue as being fortitude, and within fortitude, they made a distinction. A little bit different than the distinctions you made, Adam, but a distinction in terms of courage, endurance, and resiliency. And I'd just like us to go around again, but this time, in addition to sort of defining courage, endurance, and resiliency, if maybe you could give some examples in your own personal life or in your own profession, your own vocation, where you have been challenged or called upon to demonstrate courage, endurance, and or resiliency. So I'll kick that back to you, Soggy.
Oh, yeah. So, Adam very helpfully delineated the categories, I suppose, the way that we can try and define various types of courage. Moral courage, obviously, is something that is ongoing, isn't it? I mean, it's something that we all have to be tending to, on a very regular basis, if not daily basis. Intellectual courage is one that, especially for someone in biblical studies, because it really is dependent on what your fundamental beliefs on Scripture are at the end of the day. That's the one that I've probably had to wrestle with more than anything else. All the way back to grad study days, papers that I write, papers I present. The world of biblical studies, as you know, Bill, is incredibly cynical to some of the core beliefs of classic Christian faith and orthodoxy. And it's not an exaggeration to say that pretty much at any conference or any environment that I'm in, I'm constantly having to negotiate what it means to have courage, to stand up for, what I believe and what I think Scripture says. It's a really pernicious temptation to compromise in that area. So, if I'm being truthful and transparent, that is not only the arena in which I'm constantly thinking about courage. I suppose tied to that is the idea of endurance. If that is, you can be courageous in spurts, but are you going to be able to endure? I think of obviously Paul as he is seeing his life, close out on this side of heaven, and his letters to Timothy are probably the best example of someone who's been thinking long and hard about what it has meant to be courageous, resilient, and faithful consistently through all the various, and if you just look at the list of all the the challenges that he's had to face, physical, intellectual, emotional, and he endures. He finishes the race. And then he exhorts Timothy to do the same. But again, it's all sort of predicated on you will only be able to endure if what you are standing on is strong enough to sustain that. So for me, that is really it's been the most challenging thing for me. I have I could tell you stories about where I've chosen to teach, for example. I had grand dreams of certain kinds of research and whatnot, and even looked at going back to schools that I was very familiar with in the States, and out of the blue, an opportunity came up in basically a theological college in London, a seminary in London, one that I wasn't very familiar with at all. But the more I thought about my life and what I wanted to do with it and how I wanted to be faithful in my service to God, it became apparent that this is where God was guiding me. And, you know, that for various reasons, that was a really difficult decision to me to turn down some of the more prestigious research type fellowship things and whatnot. But, you know, God was kind. They were 7 of the best years of my life. And they really set me on the trajectory to where I am now. So yeah, I'll start with that.
Yeah, so courage even in the decision making, which may
Oh, absolutely.
be unpopular or face headwinds from even those whom we love and have close relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Soggy. Thank you. Tatenda, thoughts there on ways where, or circumstances, examples you could give us where your endurance, your courage, or your resilience have been tried and challenged?
Yeah. So as someone who is in the healthcare system, especially like in the medical field, I think one of the challenges like I've had since starting like my career is just like the imposter syndrome, where you're in spaces where you don't think you belong. However, like, you know, your calling is higher than that feeling. So just like reminding myself every day that, you know, I belong here and I am here for a reason. Because I think it's easier to get discouraged, especially if you're in places where people have titles and have had years of experience. And so every day for me, like, I have to remind myself that God's calling on me is higher than what I'm feeling. And yeah, so I think I have to, like, I experience like that moment almost on a daily basis, if I'm not, yeah.
Yeah, amen. I appreciate that. You know, it sounds like that call to exercise courage, as you said in your previous comments, on a daily basis, because the environments can be intimidating.
Yeah.
And you know, you've already accomplished a lot in the short time that you've been out of Gordon College, and which is remarkable. I look at you perhaps as having an intimidating track record for all that you've done in such a short amount of time, and so it's interesting to hear you talk about being, you know, potentially intimidated by others professionally. But you're right. Ultimately, we don't answer to our superiors in any given field, but to an audience of one in Christ. And so, thank you, Tatenda. Appreciate that. Adam, I know you've had numerous trying events with various court cases and challenges, and probably in the academic setting as well. Can you share with us a little bit about times when you were challenged and had to call upon some fortitude, some endurance?
Well, Silgi and Tatenda spoke very eloquently about endurance and resiliency. So I guess I'll put in a word for fortitude. I have had occasions to practice it. I don't know how much of it I actually possess, but of course it's a virtue. So in theory, the more I practice it, the more I should possess, right? So my scholarship primarily is in the evidence for and the foundations of really important fundamental rights, which are today very unpopular in the legal academy, like the right to life, the right of a child to know her mother and father and be legally connected to them, freedom of conscience, free exercise of religion, private property rights for ordinary people as opposed to just entitlements for the ruling elite. And all of these are very much assailed by a very skeptical legal academy today. And they're very much assailed by the activists who march down to federal district courthouses and file lawsuits to upend centuries of legal heritage in securing these rights. So I've been involved not only in the scholarly realm, but also as a public intellectual, and as you mentioned, writing briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States and state Supreme Courts. I've testified in various legislative sessions around the United States, spoken, presented papers at academic conferences. And in each one of these settings, what I found is it's really important to push through the initial resistance. And if you can do that, you often find opportunities for fruitful engagement. So just a couple of examples. So sometimes it's literally necessary to push through the resistance. So twice now I've been called upon to testify in legislative hearings where the building has been surrounded by angry protesters. And I've had to sort of work my way through the angry protesters to get into the legislative hearing assembly. But once I got in there, what I found was, despite the anger, the formal setting and the procedural strictures enabled us to have really a very reasoned and productive discourse about the evidence and the issues. I've found something similar, although more metaphorical, in the academic setting, where I've been invited to speak in academic settings as the token conservative. And you walk in there and the general attitude is sort of bristling with hostility. But the moment you start talking and producing evidence and reasons for these important civil rights, I've found people are genuinely curious, partly because they expect you to be a bigot. Only bigots believe in this stuff. And so then when they hear evidence and reasons, they're genuinely interested. They've never heard the arguments before, right? They've been taught that there are no reasons for these rights. And similarly, in more academic settings, presenting academic papers, there's almost always someone, usually several someones in the room who are going to engage with you in good faith. But sometimes to get to those people, you have to push through a good bit of resistance, and sometimes it's the resistance can be really ugly. Name calling and all that sort of thing, unfortunately, has become prevalent, as we know just from watching the news. But any of us who are in academic settings have experienced it. Yeah.
Well, that's very helpful as we think about our current society and some of the issues that plague our world today, as we said at the opening, locally, nationally, globally. And I appreciate that, because it sort of evoked the vision, Adam, of walking through the protest to get to a point of principled civil discourse to really engage the issues. And I do think that, yes, it takes courage in those moments of the discourse, but as you said, it actually takes courage to get to those moments where we can have that type of principled discourse. So I appreciate that. That affords us a great opportunity, and none of this is pre-scripted, and our interviewees don't know specifically what's coming next. And so what I would like to do then is pivot just to say, based on that, what Adam has shared, one of the aims of the Center for Faith and Inquiry at Gordon College is to seek biblical wisdom on the salient issues of the day. Not that we solve all issues of the day, but that we're seeking biblical wisdom, which of course begins with a fear of the Lord. And so as we seek biblical wisdom, there are two topics that, especially as we talk about courage in crisis, I think we would be remiss or without courage on our own if we did not address some of the needs for racial reconciliation and civil rights and racial discourse in our country, and also what is swirling with COVID-19. And here we are trying to celebrate homecoming in an interview format via Zoom, which we've become a very Zoom-driven world with meetings and Canvas for courses being run at Gordon. And so as we think about this, what does that require of us to speak into the pandemic itself, the way that we live life? For those of us on the panel that are parents, how do we think about parenting in a time of crisis? So both those are a couple of significant issues. And so I want to move into us talking about racial reconciliation and what you all have found in terms of your own courage and maybe courage that you've seen in others, and what do we have to offer on this topic of racial reconciliation as Christians in pursuit of God's will for us and Christ's desire to bring us together in Him. So I kick that back to you, and feel free to jump in.
Well, I might take up the invitation to speak about racial reconciliation for a moment. So I live in Montgomery, Alabama, which of course is where the telegraph was sent to fire on Fort Sumter. It was where the Montgomery bus boycott was organized, where Rosa Parks was arrested, where King stood on the state capitol steps in 1965 to give his famous voting rights speech, talking about the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice. And, in between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, there's really a giant black box of American history that is just now being opened up here in Montgomery. The Equal Justice Initiative, you may know, has opened a new museum in the last couple of years and a memorial to the victims of lynching between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the civil rights era. And there are thousands of them. And some of these stories are really disquieting. And of course, they raise all sorts of questions about how could a people who were committed to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Northwest Territories Act and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, how could they tolerate this? And I think the museum does a pretty good job of explaining one reason. It's a complicated picture, obviously, but one important reason, I think, is the reality that we are always capable of self-deception. We human beings are always capable of deceiving ourselves. And I think the story of that period really is the story of a massive exercise in moral self-deception. It's the failure of both moral and intellectual courage. And I think it's going to take a good bit of both moral and intellectual courage for us as Americans, for those of us who live here in the South. I'm not a Southerner, I'm from the great state of Maine, but my adopted hometown of Montgomery is very near and dear to me. And I want Montgomery to be reconciled to herself. And that requires looking honestly at what happened, at the facts, at the evidence, and saying, that was wrong. That was wrong. There are moral absolutes at play here. It's never permissible to do what was done to those victims. Exercising those virtues, I think, can go a long way toward helping heal wounds that have been reopened in recent months.
Appreciate that humility, Adam, in that self-reflection. Yeah, thank you. Tatenda, it looks like you have something to share.
Well, I agree with what Adam was saying about like how a lot of times as humans, we deceive ourselves, and being able to come to a place where we say, like what he was saying, like this was wrong. And I think with the conversations that have happened this year about like, racial issues in the US, I think one of the things I hope comes out of it is just not like the talk of like deceiving ourselves, oh, we're talking about it, so things are gonna get better, but more on like the action part. Because I think with people just talking and posting on social media, sometimes you can deceive yourselves that we are on the right track to healing this country. And yet it's more like you're just deceiving yourselves with just like talking instead of like actually putting it into work. So I really do hope that during this period, with all the conversations that have been started, we come to a place where we're like, okay, this was wrong, and this is like, these are the action steps that we have to take.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of putting feet on our faith, so to speak. Appreciate that. I'd be interested to hear more in terms of suggestions for what that looks like in our world. But Soggy looks like he's ready to share some thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know. You've just opened a can of worms, and my mind is going a million directions. I'm in two places right now. My mind is, Adam was talking about his experiences and of courage, the necessity for courage. Having lived in England for 10 years and then recently moving back to the States, I felt like Captain America, and I don't know which of the Avengers it was, but I have kids, so I have to watch these movies. Okay, that's the backdrop. But he's cybergenically frozen, and he wakes up, and he wakes up into this world, and he just, there's just times gone by he doesn't recognize it. That's almost what I felt when I came back. We moved back in 2016 when Trump was elected, and it just felt like the chasm that was kind of there when I'd left had just grown even further and further apart. And the inability of people to converse, to engage, to listen was, I think, the most marked thing. I mean, it was shocking to me. And I live in Western Pennsylvania right now. This is Trump country through and through. It is 98% white in the county that we're in. It's a whole different experience than Adams down in Montgomery. So I'm having to think about race almost from the flip side. Like how can I, as someone who has personally sort of experienced things I hope none of you do, as my children have as well. We talk about this a lot. And now we're in a world in which there is no sympathy necessarily for that. I shouldn't say no sympathy, but it's like swimming upstream here. And one of the things I keep teaching my children is learn to understand where your interlocutor, or where the person across from you, where are they coming from? Always try to understand where they're coming from first, before you rush to judgment and make assumptions. I suppose what I'm trying to say is I've learned that it is so important, especially in America in 2020, to listen carefully, to understand compassionately and sincerely all peoples, right? One of the things I've been really proud of the Asian American community is that they have, on the whole, I think, done really well to say, we want to stand by our Black brothers and sisters, and we want to listen. We want to learn what their experience was, because our experience is even different, right? We may be ethnically categorized as minorities, but our experience is not the same as people in Montgomery, Alabama, or Western Pennsylvania. And I'll add even another category in there. I spent a few weeks down in West Virginia this summer as part of this Lilly initiative, Project on Rural Ministry. Bill, you know about that, don't you? And my goodness, it's like walking into a foreign country. And the pastors that I talked to time and time and time again just kind of kept looking at me saying, what are people talking about? White privilege. If you've never stepped into Greene County, you never stepped into some of these Appalachian counties, generational poverty and all the horrific things that are going on in those communities, those people hear what the rest of the world is saying, and there's this disconnect, right? There's this cognitive dissonance where they're saying, we have no idea why are you categorizing us as race? I mean, so I suppose what I'm saying is it's been really humbling for me these past several months, sobering as well, to learn. I keep thinking I know a lot about race issues, but I'm finding that I have to first be quiet and listen. So that's really the one thing that's on my mind right now, Bill. And the one other question I have that I'm not sure I have the answer for is, what is the role of the church in all of this? How should Christians approach this? How politically should they be engaged in this? And that's a whole nother question, right? As to whether Christians should engage in sort of the politics of it, or try to stay away from that, or a combination of both and whatnot. But yeah, I'm not sure that's an answer, but those are some of the thoughts that I've been mulling over.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Soggy, at a number of levels. And I do appreciate the need to listen and hear others' experience. And I think, first and foremost, we know God does call us to humility, right? He gives grace to the humble, but opposes the proud. And as I often tell our students here at Gordon, I think we all know what side of the equation we want to be on there. We'd rather have grace than God's opposition. And so listening is a good thing. And in listening, recognizing that even people from the same ethnic background, our students that come from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, they're not all thinking and processing the same issues the same way, which is at its heart, I think, what diversity really is about. And having the courage to listen and learn from everyone's experience within that is very important, because there are a lot of different views, experiences, and ways of processing experience out there. So yeah, thank you for that. What else? I feel like there's more that you all may want to share on that, especially in light of what Soggy shared to Tenda and Adam.
I might. Okay, go ahead, Tatenda. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna touch on one of the questions that Soggy had about like what's the role of the church, because I've also been having the same questions, and because like people like my age, and I think you can speak more on this about like how our generation kind of like is waiting for the church to speak on racial issues. Like, I don't know, I just feel like for most of the people that I interact with, like there's that yearning that they're waiting for like the church to speak on certain issues so that they can be like, okay, you know, like our church is speaking on it. You know, it is encouraging to hear it from my pastor. It's encouraging to hear it from my youth pastor. And like, what's the way forward? So I've been like also like, you know, struggling with that. And I think one of the reasons is like the polarized political system in the US. Like I'm speaking as a foreigner because I'm originally from Zimbabwe. So the whole idea of like, you know, is it that you're left or right? And that can be challenging for the church. However, I think like my generation, especially with the declines in church attendance and stuff, I think it will be nice for like church leaders and like youth pastors to touch on like racial issues, because our generation really wants, you know, the people who we look up to speak on such issues and also to act on them, you know.
Yeah. So all of the above. So I endorse everything my fellow panelists have said. Two things just come to mind based on those comments. So one, Sylvie's observation about Appalachia. Yeah, there's twin dangers here, aren't there? Right. So one danger is to be tempted to just remain silent and not critically examine the continuing effects of past injustices. The other danger, of course, is to try to cram it into ideological boxes. And you know, there's this sort of you know, ideological boxes that the intersectionality movement gives us, and post-structuralist philosophy, and obviously that's a real temptation for a lot of Christians, because these things, particularly Christian academics, because these boxes are very, very popular right now in academic circles, and those are just as nihilistic and destructive as the racist tendencies to which they're responding. So there's twin dangers that we need to avoid here, but of course, courage, being a virtue, is directed toward the mean, right? And by God's grace, you know, we try to stay, we have something on which to focus, and that is truth. And when we stay focused on truth, you're able to stay on course without being distracted by all the falsities. As to the role of the church, you know, gosh, what if the church just spoke truth boldly the way she has done in the 19th century when the abolitionists were getting going, and in the early 20th century when no one else would speak out against the eugenics movement. And here in Montgomery in the 1950s, when it was Christians who got into churches, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 3 miles from my office, and started organizing the civil rights movement. What if the church just spoke the truth boldly? So just a tiny little anecdote. I had the privilege of teaching at a Christian law school. And when a lot of these issues began to surface 3 or 4 years ago, another colleague of mine, who's of a different race, got together, and we organized an event where the students were strongly encouraged to read a couple of speeches of Frederick Douglass, one before the Civil War and one after the war was ended. And the students really responded very well. The room was packed. We had a little discussion panel, which was racially diverse. And the question was simply put to them. So here's a great Christian thinker who's one of the most important thinkers in American history, who thought deeply about the requirements of natural justice for us, for our lives, for the practical problems that we have, specifically on racial issues, what would he say about our moment today? And just framing it that way, I think, is very, very helpful, because the principles are the same. The principles are universal. We know all truth is God's truth. We know that what is just is the same in 1865 as it is in 2020. The application is going to be different because the problems are different. But we always start by going back to this great intellectual heritage that has been bequeathed to us by Christians who came before. And that has tons of resources to which we can turn and that which we can employ for our current controversies and problems.
And I'll just sort of add to that, since I maybe opened that can of worm a little bit. But I really like what you said, Adam, about the need for the church just to speak truth and speak it boldly. You know, I was just thinking about Leviticus and all the laws therein, and
As one does.
as one does. And I was just, again, just so mesmerized by how relevant God's laws are, and how timeless they are, really. I mean, I appreciate that there are different ways of interpreting the book of Leviticus, but that they reflect the heart of God, right? The laws reflect the heart of God. And so much of what some churches do is, instead of really focusing on that, you know, the biblical truth of what these scripture teaches, they try to sort of make the application without thinking, imbibing deeply in the truth itself. And I also like the twin problems thing, the way that Adam framed it there, because I see this today, right? People are either not thinking deeply about the theological truths of Scripture, whether it's race, whatever it may be. And on the other side, people are almost making it a humanitarian thing. There's an effort to figure out all of these social problems through human mechanisms, when at the end of the day, race is a spiritual issue, right? Race is an issue of the heart. And so the church needs to figure out a way to get back to preaching faithfully, talking about hard things like sin and the underlying causes of race, because this is not a new thing. You know, kids growing up today, they might think that 2020 is an anomaly, but as anyone who studies history knows, I mean, this has been going on since the creation of man. And I think that's also been helpful for me to remember that, you know, I was just in Israel before COVID and just met one of the Holocaust survivors. There aren't many left now. And hearing those stories again, there is we have an alumnus who's no longer with us, who was a part of the Khmer Rouge genocide and all of that. And, you know, we think about all of these horrific racist tendencies in human history, or events in human history. And yeah, as Adam points out, at the end of the day, the church needs to have that moral courage to speak about God's ultimate redemptive plan, which is to bring all peoples, all nations, tongues, tribes under his lordship. And in order to accomplish that, the church has to be able to say, we have to submit to this king, the creator who created all people uniquely. And so I appreciate that comment by Adam and Tatenda.
Yeah, I do as well. And as Tatenda was saying, you know, we're waiting for folks in the local church to speak up. I just thought, you know, Tatenda, you haven't been up in this area recently in Massachusetts, but of course, when Tatenda is in this area, we worship at the same church, local church. And one of the things that's been encouraging at our local church is to hear people point us back to Ephesians 2. And that, yes, we can look in Isaiah chapter 2 and Revelation 4 and 5, Revelation 21, 22 about, you know, at the end of all things, Christ brings us all together. But the great thing about Ephesians 2, it's talking about what happens right now. And it talks about how really, you know, we rally around the person and the work of Jesus Christ above all things, and that he himself is our peace, our wholeness in these fractured moments. And it is solely through him, not through intersectionality or divisions that we come together, but it's through that person and work of Christ. So I just thought, Tatenda, you might also be encouraged to know that our church here in Massachusetts is speaking up on these issues. I'm sure there are a number of other churches in the area that are as well, but yeah, I appreciate that. Well,
can I say one more thing? I do think it's really important to, what we've done in our church in Pittsburgh is we've talked as a church honestly about some of the racial histories in the city, to localize it, right? So that we're not overgeneralizing things. That's been really helpful for us. You know, how has some of the housing problems caused some systemic issues, to use an inflammatory word? You know, what is the history here in Pittsburgh been like with a lot of the industrial past? And that's been really, really helpful, because then it's not this nebulous big thing out there. It's personal. This is about us. And as Adam was talking about, Montgomery has a very, very specific history. And Western Pennsylvania, Appalachia, all these communities need to sort of reckon with racial tendencies and histories and current issues going on today in a localized way. I think that's one way that at least it's given us some legs, right? It's given us something really concrete to think about. What are some things that we can really work towards in our community, as opposed to this, you know, making it a big, impossible, giant morass of a problem that will be really hard to deal with.
Well, I thank you all. I genuinely and profoundly appreciate you all being willing even to engage in this. It takes a certain degree of intellectual courage and moral courage for you all to be willing to do this interview for our community, which does have different ideas, and there may be some that don't appreciate this discussion for whatever reason, and maybe those that do. And just in a spirit of gratitude, I want to say thank you all for having the courage to engage this issue as part of our overall theme. And having said that, and knowing that we're not quite able to certainly solve these problems, just prayerfully and humbly trying to think and talk through it together as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's pivot then to another significant issue that I know we're not probably going to be able to solve today, but maybe we can again pursue biblical wisdom as we try to engage a salient issue of the day, and that's COVID-19. And Tatenda, I'm going to start with you intentionally on this one, simply because you know you have done so much work with vaccines and viruses, and I'm not going to put you on the spot and try to pin you down to when are we finally going to get a vaccine. But what I do, which would be wonderful, if you know something that we don't know, please let us in on that. But what I would like to hear from you a little bit is where do you see us needing courage as the medical community is trying to respond to this global pandemic? Where do you find us needing courage, and where have you seen courage and fortitude demonstrated in the medical community?
Yeah, so I've been working in clinical trials since beginning of 2018, and so we do my previous job, we did infectious diseases, so we did HIV, Zika, and then when COVID happened, we had to move everything to COVID. However, just touching on the courage part, so I am originally from Zimbabwe, and one of the things that drew me to vaccine research was because I've had family members die from HIV. So I've always wanted to do something that was within the HIV realm. So that kind of brought me to my job in Boston in 2018. And I remember so just as background, so HIV in the US, it's not a big thing anymore because of access to antiretroviral drugs and just access to healthcare. However, in most African countries, especially Southern Africa, the HIV rates are still very high. And sometimes it's because of lack of access to medication, and you have people dying young or people missing their medication, and then that can in turn cause like resistance, and then they won't, so it's like a spiral effect. So I remember like when I first started, especially being in the US where HIV is not like a big thing anymore. I remember so for clinical trials, we have to have clinical participants who volunteer to be given a drug. And as we are seeing right now with the current COVID pandemic, you have to have people who volunteer to be like, okay, I really want to help out, so I would be part of a clinical study. So I remember like, when I first started, like seeing people who were interested, especially in HIV, in finding an HIV vaccine or HIV therapy, especially in a country where you don't really need, we need a vaccine for HIV. However, like, in terms of like the stats, it's not as bad compared to like Southern African countries. So just seeing people who did not have HIV, who have everything going well for them, like come in and saying, okay, I want to be part of this study so that I can give back to someone that I don't know. If this works, this doesn't work, I just want to help out. So I think one of the things that I have grown to appreciate about clinical trials is the courage from participants. And I think that encourages me and a lot of people who are in vaccine trials, just like seeing people come in and like, saying, okay, I'm probably gonna, have side effects or something, but I really wanna help out the next person. So just kind of touching on that, especially with this current pandemic, when the COVID vaccine started, my team was involved with the remdesivir study, which was the therapeutic drug by Gilead. So we did that for like 2 months between March and like April. However, when talks for an actual vaccine started happening, we're involved with Johnson & Johnson one. So I remember like within 1 week, because we had to recruit fast, and as you know, because we needed as soon as possible, I remember like having people call us and be like, okay, I want to be part of this vaccine. And despite what, is going around, especially with the mistrust, with the scientific community, but just seeing people put themselves out there, I think for me, that's like nothing beats that kind of courage of being like, okay, I want to put myself out there so that I can help the next person.
Yeah, I think early on of Adam defining these aspects of courage and talking about how it requires sacrifice of us. It requires us to put ourselves on the line, often for the sake of either convictions or for others, and it really seems to come into play there. Thank you for that, Tatenda, and thank you, by the way, for your good work in this area. It looks like Adam has some thoughts to share, so please jump in, Adam.
Yeah, well, briefly, obviously this moment of the pandemic has not shown us in our best light, has it? Particularly Americans. And I think one part of the problem that I've been somewhat focused on is how this has exposed the view that Americans now have of law and the rule of law, which has really deteriorated, I think, over the last several decades. And I think we're seeing evidence of that in this moment of crisis. So just take one little illustration, talk about mask mandates. On one side, you've got people who just aren't willing to wear the masks just because a governor is telling them or a mayor is telling them to do it. And so they just can't do the courteous thing for the health and well-being of their neighbors. On the other side, you have executive officials who are issuing orders with no legislative authority, right? So you see lawlessness on both sides, and they're both saying to the other, you're being lawless, and they're both right. And so it just shows, doesn't it, that to sustain the rule of law and to sustain order and a flourishing society, you do need courage. I've been privileged now to teach for 13 years. And so now I've got alums from this law school where I teach in Alabama who are all over the southeastern United States practicing law. And I get to now witness their moral courage as they practice law and go out and try to do the right thing on a daily basis against temptations to do wrong. And that's just inspiring to me. And then the work that I do at Princeton, the summer seminar that I teach there, and other opportunities to mentor young scholars. And now I'm watching some of them go out and get academic appointments and do their own scholarship, and watch them demonstrate intellectual courage is also really, really inspiring. So like Tatenda, I take great encouragement and inspiration from those who demonstrate courage. I think there's a sense in which our moment is a little bit like the way that Charles Dickens described the moment of the French Revolution. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. There is plenty of cowardice to go around, obviously, but there's also a lot of incredible courage if you know where to look and if you're looking for it. And I take inspiration and encouragement from those who are evidencing those virtues.
Yeah, and if I can just piggyback on both of you guys, the biblical mandate is pretty clear, and I think Philippians 2, right? In humility, consider or value others better than yourselves. I think that's even a better translation. Value others better than yourselves. Why? Because Christ has set that example for us, right? Christ gave up all things so that we might live. And, you know, that's a biblical principle that I think, whilst we want to value our independence in America, is one of the fascinating things is, you know, whether it's mask wearing or whatever it may be, individual rights versus the good of others, the good of the community, the good of the collective. And it's fascinating that if you travel around the world, right, we're probably the one country where that is going to be the hardest. You, on the other extreme, you get totalitarian regimes that say you do this or there will be consequences. But then there are, you know, East Asian countries, for example, where this idea, especially in Japan, where I lived for many, many years, that you consider the other. There's a moral virtue that's really interesting that comes not necessarily from Christianity, but I think it's a biblical principle. Right? It's a biblical principle that we value others. So from a Christian perspective, it takes courage to be able to speak up on that and to say, we need to think of the others. We do need to think of the vulnerable. We do need to think of the community. Because the church, after all, is built on a community model. That is the only way it will function. And I think that's one of the reasons why Paul is so clear that we're to keep these things in mind, to consider others and not advantage oneself. Yeah.
Thank you for that, for all of you. There are so many questions. I actually want to follow up with each one of you on this topic. Let me limit it to simply ask, considering that all of you either you know what it is to be a student, and all of you actually also know what it is to teach others. And at least Adam and Soggy, you all are also parents. So I'll give you guys a choice. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions, how do we maintain courage and wisdom with our students or our professors or as parents? Any way you want to take that. But I think finding that balance of wisdom and courage in terms of you know how we engage the world around us, even as some restrictions loosen up in some parts of the country, acknowledging that the pandemic really is felt different ways in different parts of the country, isn't it? Depending on various urban and rural areas and where rates of infections have been high versus other areas. And so acknowledging that reality, how would each of you say that you try to find a balance between courage and wisdom as we seek to begin to re-engage the world in COVID-19?
Well, Bill and Soggy, you guys are the biblical scholars, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it strikes me that the lesson of Solomon is that if you ask God for wisdom, he'll give it to you. Now, there's a downside to having wisdom, which Solomon also expressed, because it helps you to see the futility of much of what the world pursues, which is a different kind of burden, right? In my experience, when I have prayed for opportunities, God does not always answer those prayers the way that I have wanted. But when I've been wise enough to pray for more wisdom, he's put people in my path or pointed me toward those who are able to provide it. And I think the biggest challenge, it strikes me, is filtering out all the noise. This goes all the way back to the trial and death of Socrates. Socrates says to his friend Crito, I don't care about the masses. I don't care about the opinion of the many. I want to know what you think, because you have wisdom. and to focus on the master, to focus on the one whom I know is rightly oriented toward the good, the right, the true, and the beautiful. We have a perfect picture of that in Christ, obviously, but in my experience in life, there are less perfect, but really excellent examples all around us. We've got to be willing to look for them. That's absolutely critical. And as a parent and as a teacher, I want to give my students and my children the desire for wisdom so that they will want to look for it. And that's really pretty much all I can do, except, expose them to it where I'm able.
So I'm not sure I understood that question, but I will just say that one of the things that I have been encouraging students, so I don't know about Gordon College or Faulkner, we're fully in person here at Grove City, that was a faux pas, Grove City College. And, I think exceptions were made for like a couple dozen students, but we got over 2,300 students here running around campus, all masked. We're teaching in classrooms. So I think is a little bit different than a lot of schools. And there is a tendency for fear. There's a tendency for just anxiety. Thankfully, we've only had, I think, 1, maybe 2 cases on campus, but, we've got protocols in place. And one of the things that I've been encouraging students here is just to remember that, this is, it is a big deal. Of course, it's a huge deal. But we are called to, in the light of this pandemic, I think we're called to be courageous. We're called to be salt and light. We're called to be the people who say, all hell might break loose, but we believe that God is in control, and we will continue to testify to that. I think Hebrews 10, where it talks, describes shrinking back, almost as if that's the opposite of courage, right? If you don't have the confidence in something, you will not have courage. And I think that's what I've been trying to teach my kids, and to teach, to encourage my students here, is to say, what, if the claims of God are true, that he is sovereign, that he is in control, that this pandemic is known by God, right? Then that gives us the confidence to stand our ground, to be courageous, to be able to trust in the Lord, and to live life wisely and for his glory. I think it's entirely possible. And I think not being fearful and being confident in Christ, I think, is what is needed for Christians.
And I think for me, I'm more on the receiving side because I'm not a parent. I'm also a student. So I think just to kind of touch on what Adam was talking about, sometimes when we're asking God for wisdom, it doesn't sometimes show up the way we are asking for it. And for me, it's been through the people I've met, and even just speaking for the 2 years, 2 weeks I've been in Baltimore. One of the things I'm very passionate about is to go back eventually to my home country of Zimbabwe. And I've been I really do want to work in the healthcare system, in the Ministry of Ministry of Health, I mean. And I remember I made my desires known to God. I'm this is what I want. And I was just God, please open the right doors for me during this time where I'm in Baltimore. And sometimes what Adam was saying, it doesn't come the way we ask for it. However, out of which is something that I had no idea. My advisor is actually from Zimbabwe, and he worked for the Ministry of Zimbabwe before independence and a little bit after independence. So he has that wisdom of those crucial time periods that I really want to learn from, on what to do and what not to do, especially if I want to go back. So just things like that, where it's for me, I'm on the receiving end, where it's I'm being encouraged by people who God is placing in my life, and especially during this COVID trial where it's like, everyone has been hit differently, depending on like where you are, and so yeah. So I'm receiving, not giving, really. So
I imagine you're giving a lot more wisdom than you're giving yourself credit there, Tatenda. We know your good work, so we thank you for that. There's a lot more questions, as I said, and in the interest of time, I just want to ask you all to answer this last one very succinctly, if at all possible. And just to say, for our final question, what is a word of advice you would want to pass on to our current alumni and our current students right now at Gordon College on courage? Just any sort of parting counsel that you would offer today to them on the topic of wisdom. And Soggy, we'll start with you.
Just one word, huh? I'll make it a few. Yeah, I think I would say, just following what I had said just previously, that, a robust doctrine of God is always taken fear away from me. I don't know what it is, but the more I delve into some of the wonderful truths about who God is, right? The vastness of God, the omniscience of God, the omnipotence of God, it just sort of puts things into perspective. I suppose I'm speaking more about not necessarily courage, but how to live well in our time. In the year 22, with everything that's going on, get to know God more. And I think that will not only make you more courageous because you realize you have nothing to lose, right? But you have everything to gain. You've already gained everything. So the more one knows God, I think that will dispel not only fears, but it will propel you to be more courageous.
Three words: just do it. I mean, I think that's a lot of what. Yeah, right. I know. I just violated Nike's trademark. They can sue me for all I'm worth. Empty judgment, paper judgment. I think that's, in many instances, that's what courage boils down to, doesn't it? Just tune out those fears, tune out those voices that Tatenda talked about earlier, and just put your head down and plow through that initial resistance. Fortitude obviously isn't alone enough. You need the endurance to see through it, those long nights and those difficult hours. But take that first step, despite the resistance, and see where God leads you after that.
yeah. I think I'm also going to add on to that, like on the just do it, and also just to encourage people that it's not always like a big, I was courageous moment. It's always like the tiny, mundane stuff that you continuously do every day, every minute. And then you look back maybe 10 years and like, oh my gosh, I was courageous, So just do it, but realize that it's not always like, a flashbulb moment every time you're courageous.
Appreciate that. And in fact, I appreciate all that this panel has shared. And I'll simply follow on as well and saying deeply appreciate, not just in a discussion of courage, but a discussion in all of life, what Soggy has shared in terms of us having a robust view of God, a robust doctrine of God that leads us forward. And so today, to our fellow alumni, our faculty, staff, and current students at Gordon College, we encourage you in that direction, putting your focus on the Lord, His work in the person of Jesus, and His work in your own life. And we offer this to you today, this interview, in a spirit of humility, hoping it will encourage you, stimulate your thought, and lead you ultimately closer to that robust doctrine of God. So thank you to each one of our panelists, Tatenda, Soggy, Adam. Delighted to have you all here. Good colleagues, good friends, and thanks so much, and a happy homecoming 2020 celebration for Gordon College. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.